Alright, so in this presentation we're going to learn some of the basic properties, characteristics of a process known as fermentation. In the animation we have a loaf of bread baking in an oven and the bread is rising. We'll talk more about this as we progress through this video. So let's go ahead and get started. Well, if we're going to talk about fermentation, we actually have to go backwards a moment and review a process called glycolysis. You've seen this before. This is the exact same animation that we saw before in the cellular respiration notes. I just copy and pasted the PowerPoint slide. So it's more for review. So here we go. Let's review glycolysis. Takes place in the cytoplasm. And what happens, you can see in the picture on the left, there's these red carbons all bonded together. That's glucose, C6H12O6. Glucose from our food is broken down. If you remember, enzymes will often break down glucose. And watch what happens when glucose is broken down. Watch what happens. 3, 2, 1. There we go. Glucose is broken down and a couple molecules of ATP are released. So that's glycolysis. We went over that process earlier. Now, those red fragments that were once glucose, those broken glucose fragments, they have a role to play still. If there was oxygen present, those red glucose fragments would go into the mitochondria, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain would occur. That's what we talked about in cellular respiration. But that's not what's going to happen today. Because the key from what I just mentioned is if oxygen's present. What we're going to learn today, fermentation occurs when oxygen is not present. So here, let's follow this. Let's move on from glycolysis, step 1. To fermentation, step 2. Here we have a picture of the periodic table square of oxygen. Notice how oxygen's just been canceled out because fermentation is an anaerobic process, which means no oxygen is involved in the fermentation process. There's two kinds of fermentation. The first is called lactic acid fermentation. It's performed by animals when muscles are not receiving oxygen. Like you see in the animation, during prolonged exercise, even though you're breathing really heavy, after you've run, let's say 2, 3, 4 times around the track, after you've run, let's say, half a mile or maybe longer, depending on how good a shape you're in, but the more you exercise, eventually you start to get tired and you're breathing really heavy. The oxygen that you're breathing is really mainly going to your brain. It keeps you from passing out. But if you want to keep going, if you want to keep exercising, you want to finish the race, you want to finish the contest that you're in, you have to keep going. You have to keep pushing yourself. The problem is your muscles aren't getting oxygen. The oxygen that you're breathing is going to your brain. But if you want to keep running the race, you have to figure out, your body has to figure out a way to keep going, even though your muscles aren't getting oxygen. And that's what we're going to see is the beauty of fermentation, particularly of lactic acid fermentation. Your muscle cells are going to perform lactic acid fermentation to keep you going, to allow you to finish the race, to allow you to finish the game. And so that's going to be kind of the beauty of lactic acid fermentation. We're going to go through it in just a few moments. Now, the side effect of lactic acid fermentation, like its name implies, is lactic acid. Lactic acid is a waste that builds up in our muscles and causes soreness. You've all felt that, I'm sure. You've all felt soreness from exercise. All you have to do is go up a couple flights of stairs. If you're at the first floor of our science building here, and you have to go all the way up to the 4th floor of our science building here on campus. Well, there's many, many steps in between. By the time you get to the 2nd floor, your legs are a little sore. By the time you get to the 3rd floor, your legs are even more sore. By the time you get to the top, your legs are burning. They're on fire. It's because lactic acid is building up in your leg muscles. Now, eventually, when you reach the top of the stairs, your legs aren't working so hard because you've hit level ground. And eventually, within 30 seconds to a minute, that soreness will go away. But we've all been really sore after hard exercises. Well, here's a little list of ways to relieve sore muscles. Massage, eat some bananas, do a post stretch, and make sure that you're staying hydrated throughout the day. We'll talk more about lactic acid fermentation in a few moments, but this is a general outline. The other kind of fermentation is called alcoholic fermentation. It's not performed by animals. It's performed, like the list says, by some yeast, some plants, and some bacteria. And the reason for the picture is because bread is a product created as a result of alcoholic fermentation. The reason it's called alcoholic fermentation is because alcohol is a waste product. The alcohol's name is called ethanol, and it's a waste. And this process, called alcoholic fermentation, is the process that we use to brew alcoholic beverages like you see in the picture. So it's kind of interesting to think about yeast. Yeast perform alcoholic fermentation. Yeast perform alcoholic fermentation, and we use yeast to make bread. So yeast give off alcohol. If that's true, which it is, it's true. Then why isn't bread alcoholic? You can see the animation from the title slide. The bread is rising. Well, alcohol is not the only waste given off. Carbon dioxide is also given off. So when yeast do alcoholic fermentation, yes, they give off alcohol. They also give off carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide causes the dough to become fluffy. But why isn't bread alcoholic? Keep in mind, you have to bake bread. The alcohol is evaporated and just burns away in the baking process. So it's a real neat process here, and it explains how yeast can be used to make bread. A little bit more on fermentation in just a moment. Okay, so what's the connection, what's the relationship with glycolysis, between glycolysis and what we're talking about today? So again, let's just refresh one more time. I know we saw a review slide at the beginning of this presentation, but remind ourselves, glycolysis takes a molecule of glucose, breaks it down into a couple fragments. The name of these fragments, by the way, are called pyruvate molecules, but that's really not too important for right now. And in the process of breaking down glucose, ATP is created. Now, what happens after glycolysis? Well, that depends. There's two directions the diagram follows. Let's follow the diagram to the right. Well, we've already talked about this earlier in the school year. If there's oxygen present, those glucose fragments will enter the mitochondria and go through the Krebs cycle and go through the electron transport chain to produce a lot more ATP. So glycolysis makes ATP, the Krebs cycle makes ATP, and the electron transport chain makes ATP. This is the preferred pathway in which the body would like to break down glucose, from glycolysis to the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain. And this works just fine as long as the mitochondria is supplied oxygen. But our topic today follows the path to the left. Today, we mentioned that fermentation is an anaerobic process. Again, this means that oxygen is not present. And so what happens when glycolysis is finished, the glucose fragments that are left behind, the glucose fragments left behind will be used in the process of fermentation, either lactic acid fermentation or alcoholic fermentation. And the molecules to restart glycolysis are created. Notice in the animation, no ATP, there's no green star coming out of the fermentation area. Fermentation makes 0 ATP molecules. That's not why fermentation is important. Fermentation allows glycolysis to repeat. glycolysis makes ATP, yes, but fermentation, no, does not make ATP. And that's one of the main ideas I want you to know. Okay, so what I'd like to do is take a moment and let's do a side-by-side compare and contrast lactic acid fermentation versus alcoholic fermentation. So let's start with lactic acid fermentation on the left. What I want you to know is the location. Where does it take place? Well, it takes place in the cytoplasm. But when it comes to alcoholic fermentation on the right, where does it take place? You can see it takes place in the same location. Both types of fermentation take place in the cytoplasm. Okay, so that's one thing they have in common. Well, what about something else? What about a different feature? Let's look at the amount of ATP created by lactic acid. Lactic acid fermentation creates zero, zip, nothing. No ATP molecules are created. But in alcoholic fermentation, oh, look at that. It also creates zero ATP molecules. So far, lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation are pretty much the same thing. Well, what about the point? The point of lactic acid fermentation. It says, make molecules to restart glycolysis. Watch the animation. We have the word glycolysis. Glycolysis leads to lactic acid fermentation, which restarts glycolysis. Okay, but what about the point of what about the point of alcoholic fermentation? Let's see. Make molecules to restart glycolysis. What? Let's look at the animation. In the animation, glycolysis leads to alcoholic fermentation, which leads back to glycolysis. Well, now I'm confused. It almost seems to me like they're the same thing. And they pretty much are. The big difference is the waste that is created in the fermentation process. In lactic acid fermentation, the waste is called lactic acid. It builds up, it causes that burning sensation in our muscles. In alcoholic fermentation, the alcohol is the waste, along with carbon dioxide. Again, bread is a fermented product. Yeast perform fermentation. The yeast will give off carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide causes the dough to fluff up and rise. The baking process simply burns away the alcohol. So this is really the big difference between the two types of fermentation, is the waste that is created. So here's a nice little flow diagram. Glycolysis on the left takes place in the cytoplasm. Glucose is split into fragments and 2 ATPs are created. Follow the top arrow. With oxygen present, glycolysis, follow the top arrow. Glycolysis with oxygen present will lead to aerobic respiration. Takes place in the mitochondria. It involves the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And a whole bunch of ATP molecules are created. The Krebs cycle makes 2 ATPs, the electron transport chain makes 32, for a total of 34, like it says in the notes there. But what we talked about today is when glycolysis is finished, what happens if oxygen is lacking? So the arrow points to the bottom box. Fermentation takes place in the cytoplasm, and those glucose fragments are broken into either lactic acid or alcohol, depending on the type of fermentation you're talking about. No ATP is made, but the molecules to restart glycolysis are created. And follow the arrow. The arrow on the left restarts glycolysis. So this cycle, glycolysis, fermentation, back to glycolysis, fermentation, back to glycolysis, fermentation, back to glycolysis, fermentation. This process happens over and over and over again. You can't live your entire life off of it, but it'll make enough energy. Glycolysis will make enough ATP, enough energy to finish a race, or do a couple more bench presses if you're lifting weights, or get to the top of the stairs if you're climbing steps. So that's the purpose of fermentation. It'll restart glycolysis. So here we have the end of the notes. Go ahead and pause the video. Try to answer these questions right here. Put your answers on a separate sheet of paper. I'd be happy to check them for accuracy. Bring your answers either before school or after school. Go ahead and pause the video. Good luck.